Center for the Study of World Religions, Harvard Divinity School.
My name is Gina Zurlo. I'm a senior researcher and lecturer in world Christianity here at Harvard Divinity School. And this semester, I'm teaching a class at HDS called Global Religious Change, Babies, Converts, Migrants. And this class is essentially about the demography of religion. My students are here today. Thank you, my students. They had to be here, and we fed them. So it was a double win. And so what we're talking about is how religion changes globally. And there's really only a few ways a religion can grow or decline. A religion grows because you're born into it, you convert into it, or you migrate into that country. A religion declines if you die, if you leave that religion, or you emigrate from that country. So you subtract the negative from the positive, and that's how you get the net religious change. That's what we call the 6 dynamics of religious change. Now, it just so happens that the Pew Research Center back in June released a very important report with their findings on global religious change from 2010 to 2020, with all of their new estimates of what is happening worldwide, country by country, in terms of religion and non-religion for 2020. And so when this report came out in June, I had to redo my whole class. So thank you, Conrad, because I had to take into consideration what are the latest findings from this major project in the demography of religion. So I reached out to my friend and colleague, Conrad Hackett of the Pew Research Center, and asked him to come to HDS so we could have a conversation about what Pew is finding in terms of global religious change, what we are finding. I'm the editor of the World Christian Database and the World Religion Database. And so I wanted to have a conversation about differences in approach to whether or not the world is becoming more or less religious. Seems like a big question, but it's actually a complicated set of answers. So Conrad graciously agreed to come with us. And then I hijacked the Monday lunch from the Center for the Study of World Religion. So I'm very thankful to Charlie Stang, which I thought would just be a small conversation over at the CSWR. We turned into a public event. So thank you for letting us borrow this time. This is the normal Monday lunch and lecture time for the CSWR affiliates, where we talk about all things related to religion worldwide, past, present, and maybe even future. So thank you all for being here today. Thank you to the Dean, Marla Frederick, for being here. Thank you again to Conrad, to all those who came from the HDS community and beyond. We're really delighted to have you here today. So I'm going to introduce Conrad, our speaker, and then Conrad will share findings from the Pew Research Center report, and then I'll share some findings from the World Christian Database Project, and then we'll open it up for a time of Q&A. So Conrad Hackett is Associate Director of Research and Senior Demographer at the Pew Research Center. His expertise is in international religious demography, sociology of religion, and how religion relates to characteristics including gender, fertility, and education. Hackett received his doctorate from Princeton University's Department of Sociology and Office of Population Research, and was a Postdoctoral Research Fellow in the University of Texas at Austin's Population Research Center. He also earned 2 graduate degrees from Princeton Theological Seminary. He is author of several Pew reports, including The Future of the World Religions, Population Growth Projections 2010 to 2050, Religion and Education Around the World, The Global Religious Landscape, The Gender Gap in Religion Around the World, Global Christianity, and the Global Catholic Population. He frequently presents demographic research at scholarly conferences in the US and abroad. He has discussed global religion with numerous media outlets, including the BBC, CNN, NPR, the New York Times, and the Wall Street Journal. So please join me in welcoming Conrad Hackett.
Thank you. Thank you, Gina. It's my honor to be with you here today. As Gina was talking about the work that I'm involved in, it occurred to me that about 20 years ago, I got started in this business when I was a graduate student in sociology and was part of a group that was evaluating this thing called the World Christian Database, which is a phenomenal work. First volume came out about 1980. And there have been 2 subsequent editions. It's this huge book, an encyclopedia of religion around the world that chronicles an amazing number of religious groups and their size. And so we wanted to evaluate this and compare it to other sources of information. And I remember thinking as I worked on this project that this is just a ridiculously ambitious project. I mean, what kind of person or team wants to track hundreds of groups around the world and these Christian denominations that are constantly changing and surveying people in 200 countries? And then a couple of years later, I got invited to work at Pew Research Center and do the same kind of thing. Now, as Gina will tell you later on at Pew, we've taken a much more conservative approach. We now measure the size of 7 religious groups compared to the 85 or so large. Gina will tell you all of the details about how many groups they're now studying, but they're much more ambitious than we are. And in my talk today, I want to do 2 things. As Gina said, I do want to tell you about the findings in this report that we put out in June. And there are some copies that might be circulating around. So if some of you can take a copy home if you want, they're also available online. And the first thing I want to do, though, is address the topic that was in the title of this gathering today: is the world becoming more or less religious? And I will make the argument that the world is in a process of a secular transition, and that, as the title slide here says, the world's countries are generally becoming less religious. Now, this is our obligatory slide about the Pew Research Center. Many of you will have heard of us. We are funded by the Pew Charitable Trust, and our global religion work is funded by the John Templeton Foundation. We're a nonpartisan, non-advocacy group, so we're not trying to advocate for or against the growth of religion. Our intent is just to describe the change that is taking place in the world. Now, before I dig into our findings and a theory about religious change, I just want to acknowledge that there have been a lot of headlines about what's going on in terms of religious change around the world. And I want to suggest that you should be skeptical about these headlines. In the UK, there was a report that came out this spring that suggested there's been a 56% increase in the share of people in England and Wales who are church-going Christians between 2018 and 2024. In the United States, there has been research that's come out in the last month or so that suggests that young adults are flocking to Christian congregations, and that most people in churches today are young, and that there are more young men in churches than young women, and men of all ages are in churches more than women. And then there are similar kind of stories cropping up in places like Northern Ireland and France. And I won't go into this in detail, but what all these studies have in common is that they're based on non-probability opt-in survey panels. And what my colleagues at Pew Research Center have found is that there are a lot of people who take surveys as a way to earn money, and surveys have screeners where if you say you have certain characteristics, you're more likely to get invited to take the full survey. And in general, among people who take online surveys, there is a shortage of people who are young, a shortage of people who are Hispanic. So a lot of people who are trying to kind of game the system to get the rewards of opt-in surveys will say, sure, I'm a young guy. And then they'll also say, yes, I attend regularly. Now, not all opt-in survey data is fraudulent, but there's enough that it may explain some of these patterns, because unfortunately, these are all outliers. Like my experience in Christian congregations is very much different from the stories that Barna is telling. And we have data now in the UK. Just this morning, I got the latest data from the British Social Attitude Survey that shows that, in fact, in the UK, there's been a steady decline, including in the latest 2024 data, in the share of people in Britain who are church-going Christians. And in fact, the data from the Anglican Church, from the Catholic Church in England and Wales, does not confirm this story of a quiet revival in England. So let's just, for now, let's set aside all of these misleading headlines. We could talk about them later if you want, but I don't think they give us the most helpful insight into what's happening in the world. The too long didn't listen version of my comments today is that in many countries, like undergrads here at Harvard, are growing more secular. And what I'm alluding to regarding Harvard undergrads is the survey data from the Harvard Crimson, the most recent data of which was for the class of 2027, at which point, according to this survey, 46% of Harvard undergrads coming to the school identified as atheist and agnostic, up from 32% 10 years earlier. As far as I could tell, there was no data published on last year's entering class religion, and I guess maybe in December, there might be an update about the class of 2029. So in my title, I use the phrase secular transition, and that may not be a familiar phrase to all of you. That's a model of religious change that British social scientist David Vos developed, and he argues that there are certain kinds of changes that societies experience. They tend to experience them once, and then it's unusual to backtrack on those changes. In many senses, they're like squeezing toothpaste out of a tube. You can get it back in, but it's really hard and kind of an unusual thing to do. And the best metaphor or precedent for the religion transition is the demographic transition. And this is a slide that has a lot going on that explains some of the dynamics of the demographic transition. One of the most important things to know is that the decline in fertility around the world has happened, it began at different places at different times. So France was one of the first countries to experience a decline in the number of children women had. And countries in sub-Saharan Africa are among the last places where we're beginning to see decline in fertility. And when there's a decline in fertility, oftentimes it follows a decline in death rates. And so that leads for a period to population increase. Even while birth rates are going down, populations go up. That's what's happening globally in the world right now. Most countries have below replacement fertility, but for a time anyway, the world's population is still increasing. So what does the secular transition look like by contrast? What can I do here? Okay. Less distracting stuff. So here's a slide that outlines the way that some co-authors and I, who put a paper in Nature Communications a couple months ago, suggested that the secular transition unfolds. In the early stages of a secular transition, which is the stage that many countries in Africa are in right now, and European countries were in 100 or more years ago, you start to see a decline in participation. People are going to church, mosque, synagogue less frequently. In the medium stage of a secular transition, which is where we think the United States is right now, you would see declines in church going, in the importance that people attribute of religion in their lives, and a decline in the share of people who belong to a religion. And then in the late stage of the secular transition, we see a decline primarily in the share of people who are identifying with religion. And in this paper, what we looked at was the difference between younger and older people in society, those under 40 and those over 40. And this slide, I apologize, it has a lot going on. It's a complicated slide, but on the right-hand side of the dividing line, the bars indicate the size of the gap between younger and older generations. So this first blue group of countries includes a lot of countries in Africa and Asia. And the text says stage one, the age gap is primarily in participation. In Senegal, for example, younger people are 14 percentage points less likely than older adults to attend worship services regularly. And on the other two measures, the differences are generally not significant. All of this survey data is Pew Research Center survey data that's been gathered over the last 15 years or so. In stage 2, the age gap can appear on all 3 indicators. So in the United States, we have gaps observed in participation, importance, and belonging. And then in the third panel, these are heavily European countries and also some places in East Asia like Hong Kong are in stage 3, where the gap between youngest and oldest people is primarily in the share of people who belong to any kind of religion. Denmark is depicted here as an example. So this is our model of what's going on. We think that just like the fertility transition began in Europe and then spread to the rest of the world, so too the secular transition was most evident in European countries. And we see evidence that it is taking place now in other parts of the world. Before I came here, I watched some videos where Harvey Cox and Peter Berger talked about secularization, and their take was that some of the claims made in the 1970s were misleading because they emphasized the European experience. And in the early 2000s, it was clear that religion was thriving in other places. But now what I contend to you is that we have evidence that in other parts of the world, we're starting to see the secular transition that was evident earlier in Europe, just as the fertility or demographic transition also began at different times in different places. And just this last week, there was a Gallup World Poll report that came out that showed the drops in their measure of the importance of religion. And what they highlighted was that their most recent data for the United States showed that the 10-year difference between 2015 and 2025 of 17 points or so was one of the largest 10-year declines they'd seen in the importance of religion. And these other countries that had large declines also in fairly recent years are also OECD countries, basically more wealthy countries. So in the US case, this is the kind of evidence that we expect in a country that's in the middle of the secular transition. So now I want to transition to talking a little bit more in general about our report. My team at Pew Research Center focuses on analyzing census and survey data to measure change in the size of religious groups around the world, measure change in how people identify. And this is something where we'd expect countries going through the late stages of the secular transition would see pronounced declines. So the data we use includes country censuses that measure religion, such as South Africa, Australia, Canada. The biggest religion data collection effort in the world is the Indian census, although India still hasn't conducted their 2020 census round yet, but they're working on it. So we also have survey data from various barometer projects, the World Values Survey, the Demographic and Health Surveys program has conducted phenomenal research, including measures of religion in African countries and some Asian countries. We hope that there'll be funding in the future to continue that important work. So in terms of what we found, we began our work in 2010. And I, again, want to emphasize that when we began this work, our colleagues, Todd Johnson, Gina Zurlo at the World Christian Database were phenomenally generous in helping us get set up with the initial database infrastructure we had and beginning this work. We're so grateful for their help. And so we had some 2010 estimates that we published about a decade ago, and now we've got estimates for the world in 2020. And in order to make sure that we're measuring change accurately, we went back and in some case made some adjustments to our 2010 measures to make sure they're really comparable to the 2025 numbers. And what I want to emphasize is the change at the country level. So we looked at the number of countries where there was a 5-point change in the share of people who belong to one of our 7 categories. And the thing that really jumps out here is that there were 35 countries where the religiously unaffiliated category, that includes people who identify as atheist, agnostic, or with no religion in particular, 35 countries grew by at least 5 percentage points in the size of that group. And there were 0 countries that experienced a 5-point decline in the unaffiliated share. For Muslims, it was kind of a wash, 3 countries growing 5 percentage points, 2 declining. And then for Christians, there were 40 countries where the Christian share shrunk by at least 5 points. And generally, those are the same countries that are experiencing an unaffiliated increase. Now, in terms of the picture at the global level, what's striking is that there was a nearly 2 percentage point increase in the Muslim share of the world's population over just this 10-year period, and a similar decline in the Christian share of the world's population. The only group, aside from Muslims, that increased in size from 2010 to 2020 was the unaffiliated population. And the Buddhist population actually decreased as a share of the world's population and also in absolute number. So why did this happen? The most interesting dimension, arguably, is the phenomenon of religious switching. And we had about 117 countries where we've recently asked people what religion they grew up in and what religion they identify with today. And so by aggregating that data and weighting it by country size, we can estimate roughly what are the patterns of religious switching that have shaped the religious landscape over the last few decades. And the story is that among people who were raised in any religion, there were 3.2 people who left for every person who was raised without a religion and joined any religion. And there's a similar pattern for Christianity specifically. So for every person who became Christian from no religion or from Islam or Hinduism or any other religion, there were 3.1 people who left Christianity. So this is driving a tremendous amount of change. I should say that among Muslims and Hindus, not only was there a roughly even mix of people coming in and out, but the actual levels of people who were switching at all in Islam or Hinduism was very small. Oops. Now, this chart shows the relationship between switching religions and a country's Human Development Index. The Human Development Index is based on education, mortality, GDP per capita, and those countries that are higher on the Human Development Index include many that are colored here in red, indicating that Christianity is the largest religion in those countries, or orange, indicating that Buddhism is the largest religion. They have experienced a lot of switching. On the other hand, there are countries all along the HDI spectrum in which there's a Muslim majority, or in Israel's case, a Jewish majority, and those countries have not seen much switching. Another phenomenon that's really important for understanding religious change, as Gina mentioned, is fertility. And when we put out a report 10 years ago projecting religious futures, we estimated the fertility differences between religious groups. And at that time, Muslims had the highest fertility, and that I'm sure is still true today, although all of these numbers have probably changed to some degree. Christians globally have very high fertility, driven especially by the high fertility of Christians in sub-Saharan Africa. Hindus at the time had above replacement fertility, although almost all Hindus, 94% plus, are in India, which now has below replacement fertility. The world's Jewish population benefits from the high fertility of Jews in Israel. And all the other groups, the unaffiliated, Buddhists, and the other religion category, which is an umbrella category that includes everything from Sikhs, Shintos to Scientologists, also has below replacement fertility. A couple other interesting results from our work is that back in 2010, we estimate Europe was the part of the world that had the largest number of Christians. By 2020, the Christian population in Latin America and the Caribbean outnumbered the European Christian population, and the largest share of the world's Christians were in sub-Saharan Africa. This is a trend that our colleagues at the World Christian Database have anticipated for a long time, and now it's clearly the case. Something else that's striking is that when it comes to the unaffiliated population of the world, China has 7 times as many religiously unaffiliated people as the countries with the next largest unaffiliated populations, the US and Japan combined. So when we talk about the experience of unaffiliated people globally, in our data, that's heavily shifted towards the experience of China. If we think about the makeup of the world's countries, Christians still have a majority of the population as of 2020 in 120 countries around the world, which is very striking because it's much greater than the Christian share of the world. That is, the Christians are a majority in 60% of the world's countries and territories, although Christians make up about half that share of the world's population, 29%. Muslims, by contrast, make up the same share of the world's population and of the world's countries and territories. Now, all of the material from our report is available, the PDF of the report, our data set download, an interactive table where you can sort it and see what are the countries that have the most Christians, what are the countries that have the most unaffiliated, and so forth. And so this is my last slide. In summary, my argument is, yes, the world's countries are becoming less religious, even though the thing I didn't talk about in these slides is that the world's, it's kind of hard to know what's going on in terms of whether the share of people who are religious globally is going to increase or not in the future. It could be that for a little while, just as the world's population count is increasing because of the lingering effects of high fertility, so too we may continue to see an increase in the share of people globally who identify with any religion because of the lingering effect of Africa's population growth and the fact that countries that have large unaffiliated populations have lower fertility. But in the long term, I think that just as we'll see global population decline, we will probably also see a reduction in the share of people who identify with any religion. I'm not forecasting that religion is going to disappear. The idea here is just that there's a one-time transition where we'll probably see less of the taken for granted nature of religion that at one time characterized all societies. So that's my perspective, and I'll look forward to the perspective that Gina will share with us.
All right. Thank you so much, Conrad, for coming and for sharing those perspectives from the latest Pew Research Center report. So I'm going to offer some perspectives from the World Christian Database in response. So first, I'd like to share a little bit of history of how all this work began, followed by some methodological considerations that go into the demography of religion. And then we'll do a little bit of comparison between the 2020 estimates between Pew and the WCD with a focus on China. So we start with history because the World Christian Database project began at a very specific point in time in the 20th century, and the methods that were developed there continue to inspire our work today. So our story begins with David Barrett, who was a British Anglican aeronautical engineer who worked for the British Royal Aircraft Establishment after World War II. However, they had him working on bomb design, which did not align well with his pacifist leanings. So he decided to become a missionary priest instead. So these are your career options: bomb design or missionary priest. Barrett was sent to Nyanza province in Western Kenya in 1957, and when he arrived, he realized massive changes were underway in African Christianity. African-led Christian movements were breaking away from the Western churches, creating what we now call African independent or initiated Christianity. And because Barrett was a scientifically oriented guy, he started to count. He started to count these new Christian groups in Kenya, in East Africa, Sub-Saharan Africa, and then expanded his analysis to the entire world. In the 1960s and 70s, Barrett traveled to 212 countries looking for the best available data on Christianity and other world religions. There were only 223 countries in the world at the time, so he goes almost every country. And pictured here are actual passport pages from Barrett's passports that we have in the World Christian Database Archive. And when he traveled, he would look for unpublished material, locally available information. He would interview ecumenical leaders and speak with elderly Christian leaders to obtain an oral history about how Christianity had developed among their people. In doing this, Barrett pioneered a new global methodology using different kinds of sources, methods, and assumptions, which was required to make new discoveries of religion in the modern world. In 1968, famous sociologist of religion Peter Berger predicted the utter demise of religion by the year 2000. Berger was certain that, quote, by the 21st century, religious believers are likely to be found only in small sects, huddled together to resist a worldwide secular culture. It's all very dramatic. Barrett, however, was working from Kenya, and looking around, that looked like a pretty religious place to him. He published an article in 1970 saying there'd be 350 million Christians in Africa by the year 2000, certainly not the demise of religion. In the 90s, Peter Berger famously recanted his position and said, quote, I think what I and most other sociologists of religion wrote in the 1960s was a mistake. It's the greatest act of academic humility ever on record. And it's true, by the year 2000, essentially, Barrett was right. After travel to nearly every country of the world, gathering statistics on over 20,000 Christian denominations and every major world religion, he published the World Christian Encyclopedia in 1982 and presented a copy to Pope John Paul II at the Vatican. The World Christian Encyclopedia marked an important point in 20th century global religious history. This was the first time all the world's Christians were together in a single book with no exclusions. It had Catholics, Orthodox, Protestant, all those new African independents, evangelicals, Pentecostals, you name it, the book had them. And it represented a great ecumenical vision, and for the first time, clearly laid out in hard numbers Christianity's demographic shift to the global south. But the encyclopedia was also a great interreligious project, because before the publication of this book, nobody really knew how many Muslims or Buddhists or atheists or Hindus were in the world. Barrett was the first person to conduct a global census of religion and non-religion, and in doing so, pioneered what we now call the demography of religion. Barrett had dreamed of creating what he called digital databanks, where quantitative data on religion could be stored and used by researchers. Barrett's successor, Todd Johnson, who is here, launched the World Christian Database in 2003 and the World Religion Database in 2008, fulfilling Barrett's vision. These are the longest running and most comprehensive quantitative databases of membership and affiliation, reporting on trends in all 237 countries in the past, present, and future. The methodological foundation of the databases are still in the spirit of Barrett's pioneering work of combining what we can know globally with local knowledge. We are attempting to measure the de facto situation of religion and non-religion on the ground. So let's take a look at some of the methodological considerations in the demography of religion, including major sources and taxonomies. I'm so excited, taxonomies. So Pew provides estimates for 6 world religions, including the unaffiliated, plus 1 category for others, whereas the WCD reports 16 categories of religion, plus 2 for non-religion, agnostics and atheists, with no category for other. So all the 8 billion people in the world have to fit into these categories. It's really just one big puzzle. If you like puzzles, it's fine. Of note are two categories related to traditional religion: ethnic religion, which are traditional religions found all over the world, and Chinese folk religion, a unique combination of Chinese traditional religion, Buddhism, Taoism, and Confucianism. Three major sources of quantitative data on religion inform the World Christian Database: government censuses, social scientific surveys and polls, and institutional data. Censuses are generally considered the gold standard, and about half of the world's countries ask a religion question on their census. They're comprehensive in that they attempt to count the entire population, but there are clues in censuses that can help us even if a religion question isn't asked, like questions on ethnicity, language, and country of origin. Surveys take representative samples of a population and ask questions about affiliation in addition to beliefs and practices. Many surveys have small sample sizes and don't capture smaller religions well. There's also many countries where it's impossible or even extremely difficult to do survey work, like in many sub-Saharan African countries, the Middle East, Central Asia, and even the Pacific Islands. The WCD is less likely to rely on surveys because of representation issues and because many surveys are translations of or adaptations of Western sources that lack context to the areas under study. And then institutional data is from religious communities themselves, comes in the form of annual yearbooks like the Annuario Pontificio of the Roman Catholic Church, denominational reports, self-report measures, custom spreadsheets from statistical offices, and a ton of unstructured data online. The World Christian Database collects this information every 5 years to inform our denominational estimates. So we gather as much data as possible, we triangulate it, we weigh the validity of sources to arrive at our best estimates. Sometimes our estimates align with a census or with a particular set of institutional data, but often they differ based on our own assessment in consultation with in-country experts. We have amassed a large global network of scholars and religious leaders that help inform our work. Related to the taxonomy are different interpretations of the non-religious. Pew's category of the religiously unaffiliated includes atheists, agnostics, and people who check nothing in particular on a survey. The WCD doesn't have categories for none or nothing in particular, just atheists and agnostics. So it very well could be that people who check nothing in particular on a survey get grouped into a country's majority religion in the WCD. I imagine there are a lot of, for example, baptized Christians, which is a form of self-identification, who check nothing in particular on a survey because they consider themselves to be non-practicing Christians. At the same time, we know that many non-religious people still hold religious or spiritual beliefs and participate in religious and spiritual activities. So you might think it's an obvious question to figure out who is religious and who is not, but it is actually one of the most complicated questions. There is a ton of gray area happening here. And I want to share an example of how complicated the art of demography can be, looking at Christianity in Nepal. So Nepal moved from a Hindu monarchy to a secular state in 2011 and held its first census since becoming a democracy. The census reported Christianity at 1.4% of Nepal's population. However, this differed significantly from some on-the-ground estimates from Nepal's Christian leaders, which were upward of 8%. There were a lot of issues with the census. First, enumerators didn't visit every house, and many operated under the assumption that anyone with a Hindu name should be counted as a Hindu. There's well-documented restricted religious freedom, hostility towards minorities, and governmental favoritism towards Hinduism and Buddhism. Converts to Christianity often conceal their faith for social or safety reasons. And from what we know about the growth of Christianity in the country, a lot of it is happening in the rural areas, which is much harder to track. Several years ago, I had a research assistant who grew up in Nepal and went back home to interview some Christian leaders about what was happening in the country. They told them that they had actually recently completed the National Christian Community Survey, where they trained 300 undergraduate students in research methods and sent them out to every single province in Nepal. They collected data on how many churches, how many affiliates, and how many leaders were in all of these provinces, including a gender breakdown of all of those categories. It was a remarkable report. The report said that Nepal was 2.3% Christian. not nearly as high as the 8% that the leaders said, but also not as low as reported on the census. You can see here that the World Religion Database estimates Christianity in Nepal at just over 4%, which is none of the other estimates. So the National Christian Community Survey had a very particular definition of who counted as Christian, which didn't include Catholics, Seventh-day Adventists, Mormons, and other self-identified Christian groups. So this is just one tiny country. So we have to do this for 237 countries in the World Christian Database. Okay, so let's take a look at some of the largest differences in the 2020 estimates between Pew and the WCD-RD. Of the roughly 1,200 country religion estimates in Pew's report for 2020, a little half of them are sourced from surveys, next censuses, and actually 12% of the estimates are from the World Religion Database. There are more similarities than differences between our two projects. Over half of the estimates were essentially zero difference at all. 80% were within 5% difference, and 90% were within 10% of each other. There are some underlying WCD assumptions that contribute to differences in our projects. The first is official data. Official data doesn't always tell the whole story of what's happening on the ground. Remember, we are tracking the de facto situation as closely as possible. And so as a result, we're willing to make some estimates for where official sources might be lacking, even if those estimates are less precise. For example, we're going to make a different set of estimates than the government for Christians in India and Iran, because it's widely observed that these countries undercount religious minorities. The next assumption is about public versus private religion. In situations of minority status, some Christians, for example, may publicly express Islam, Hinduism, or Buddhism, but privately they practice Christianity, and they do this for safety, political, social reasons. These communities can be extremely difficult to quantify, but we know they exist. We'd rather estimate their existence than not acknowledge them at all. There are large communities of Christians like this in Bangladesh, India, and throughout the Middle East. Of the roughly 250 differences between Pew and WCD of religions, over 100,000 and 20% in 2020, 32% are sourced to censuses, and 67% are sourced to surveys. And there are several categories of discrepancies that illustrate our approaches, such as differences in projection methodology, which sources to consult for East Asia, what qualifies as self-identification as religious, and what to do when different sources report different figures. Also, each project could be choosing a different affiliation for people who hold multiple religious affiliations or no affiliation. So looking at the largest differences by absolute number and percentage, you'll see from this chart that most of those differences are in East Asia, except for the non-religious in the US and India. In most cases, Pew reports more non-religious and the WCD reports more religious. So a big question on how religious the world is how religious East Asia is. What defines religion in East Asia, and can it be measured the same way as we measure religion in Western settings? As I said, we don't use survey data in this region to measure affiliation because of problems using Western surveys translated into Eastern languages. You can also see here that China tops this list, where Pew reports far more non-religious, and the WRD reports more Buddhists and Christians. So the WCD reports China as 61% religious, and Pew reports it as 10% religious. That is a huge difference for a country of 1.4 billion people. The WCD, for example, reports tens of millions of Chinese Christians, both Catholic and Protestant, affiliated to the unregistered churches that do not show up on surveys and on government data. But it doesn't mean they don't exist. So a big part of whether the world is becoming more or less religious hinges on China. One question we could ask is, how well does the Chinese General Social Survey reflect religiosity in China? Is it possible that China became more religious between 2010 and 2020 per the WRD, but the Chinese General Social Survey missed it? Are more people leaving religion than joining it? Is the world becoming more or less religious? Well, like any good social scientist, it depends. It depends on, this is my favorite, what is religion really? What is self-identification as religious or non-religious? Who are the unaffiliated? What exactly are we measuring? What is happening in East Asia, in particular China? What do we do with official versus unofficial, public versus private affiliation? And then my favorite consideration is what makes good data in the sociology and demography of religion?
CSWR.HDS.Harvard.edu. Copyright 2026. The President and Fellows of Harvard College.